Alright guys, welcome back to F1 News. Mercedes are intending to save their 2023 campaign with a huge B-spec upgrade they're bringing to Imola in just a few weeks' time. But it appears rumours are circulating that part of this upgrade will involve straight line speed improvements. Again, they are suffering compared to Red Bull in a straight line. Not as much as last year, but with the DRS Open, nobody can match the RB19, and that's one of Mercedes' key intentions to improve if they have any chance in a race to actually take down the Red Bull. Very much enjoyed your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy, subscribe if you're new as always. Couple of quick updates here from around the grid in terms of upgrades that teams are bringing. Fernando Alonso expects over the European races over the coming 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 races type thing that the order is going to change. Now he doesn't necessarily mean that anyone's going to be able to stop the Red Bull, but he does expect that some of the levels of teams is going to change around. On average over the first few races, the Aston Martin has been the strongest car outside of the Red Bull of course, but in Australia it was a slightly different story. The Ferrari actually had the marginally faster race pace than the Aston Martin and the Mercedes, but historically Australia isn't always the greatest indication of what the competitiveness is going to be over the course of a season. AlphaTauri though, that car is just terrible. Yuki Tsunoda is trying his best with it, but he picked up 1 point in Australia, which was hard fought and well deserved. But even De Vries, who's certainly been struggling so far, says we're not bringing a game-changing upgrade, it's just going to be steady improvements. But with other teams around them also making steady improvements or substantial improvements, that's probably not going to be enough for AlphaTauri to do anything this season, so I feel kind of bad for those guys, but that car has fallen off a cliff over the last couple of years. Even Baku last year, right? I mean, Gasly got a P5 in Baku, did he not, last year in the AlphaTauri, so not looking so good this year. The Alpine, though, was rapid in Baku last year. You guys might remember. We'll have a look at the numbers here in a few minutes' time to kind of see how far the Mercedes are behind where they need to get to, but the Alpine was running like no wing in Baku last year, were rapid, and this year they're bringing big upgrades. They say in Baku they're going to gain 3/10, a little bit later in Miami, and then more so come Imola. So Alpine are trying to close the gap considerably. Ferrari are also sticking to their SF23. We heard rumours that were kind of conflicting over the last few days what their plan was going to be, but it's now pretty much been confirmed. They are going to bring several upgrades to their car in May, and then we'll assess if their concept is worth pursuing. Now, Mercedes have come to the realisation that, you know, they can't stick with what they're doing. They've got to copy the Red Bull route to at least some degree. That's what Aston Martin have done to a certain extent with great success so far. Ferrari are still convinced, just because their car is occasionally quite good in qualifying, that their concept is going to work, even though Carlos Sainz said a couple of weeks ago now that it does feel like the Red Bull is better in almost every way. So, you know, if they were quicker in one thing, if they were quicker in quali, if they had better tyre deg Ferrari, then there might be an argument to say, but the Red Bull is literally better in every measurable metric than the Ferrari, so it does make you wonder whether they're going down the wrong route here, sticking with their design, and whether they're going to leave even more time on the table, given that it's taken Mercedes this long to change their minds. Ferrari apparently haven't come to that realization yet. But Ferrari are also looking at the mega DRS advantage that Red Bull have. Vasseur says the advantage is mega big, dare I say bigger than everybody else. We have to understand how they are able to do something like this, because the pure straight line speed of the Red Bull, not including DRS, is not outrageous compared to the competition. The other cars definitely made an attempt over the winter to make their cars more efficient in a straight line. Ferrari even said, I think Charles Leclerc said, their car is now faster in a straight line, not just because of their engine upgrade that they supposedly made over the winter, although we don't really see too much evidence of that, but in terms of the fact that they made the car less draggy, and therefore, yes, it creates less downforce, but there's a trade-off, right? Last year, the Red Bull, at the start of the season, was certainly not always the fastest car in the corners or in the traction zones, but it was the fastest in a straight line, and once the Red Bull was ahead of a Ferrari in a race, it was almost always game over, because the Ferrari, even with DRS, for example, Canada last year when Sainz was trying to chase down Max Verstappen, it was just never going to happen. Same story in Saudi Arabia last season when Leclerc, once Verstappen got him, there was no way back because the straight line speeds of the Red Bull, even without the DRS, was just so much stronger. So Ferrari and Mercedes and others tried over the winter to close the gap to the Red Bull, and they've succeeded, but it has hurt some of their cornering performance, certainly with Ferrari, you've got to say. And with the DRS Open, the Red Bull is still just built different to everybody else. It seems part of it's ERS deployment, but part of it is just great aerodynamics at the rear of the car. It seems they can dump more drag with DRS than anybody else can, and Ferrari and others are going to have to figure out what they can change to allow that to happen. But it's obviously going to be top of their priority list for even Mercedes and certainly Aston Martin to try and figure this out. And by the numbers, that is where the real advantage of the Red Bull lies. So this article here from Formula Uno discussing the Aston Martin situation, there's an average gap of 6.2 2 kilometers an hour on the straight, but the Aston Martin AMR23 is the closest to the Red Bull in the corners, only losing 1.5k on average in the corners in terms of speed to what the Red Bull is capable of through the corners, and of course more cornering speed equals faster car. Now the AMR23 is somewhat limited by the, effectively, because Mercedes went for their no pod design against zero pod design, their gearbox had to be made slightly differently, and giving that to Aston Martin has reduced the efficiency of the diffuser, and you'd imagine it's also reduced the efficiency of Mercedes diffuser as well, which I guess they thought there was a trade-off there with the benefits they would get from the zero pod versus the reduced effectiveness of the diffuser, which also reduces the effectiveness of their DRS as a result. So those are some issues that Aston Martin and Mercedes will be having to solve, and Mercedes are in a similar boat, to be honest, to the Aston Martin. Now, their straight line speed this year isn't terrible compared to the Red Bull. They're 2.6 kilometers an hour slower right now behind the Red Bull in a straight line, and only lose about 2 kph to the Aston Martin in the corners. So the W14, especially including Australia, is faster in a straight than the Aston Martin, marginally slower than the Aston Martin in the corners, and it is significantly better in a straight line than the W13 was, most certainly. And also the engine does seem to be slightly more promising this year for the Mercedes. Now, they were talking about it actually pushes on. It seems to have an extra bit of oomph this year than it did at the start of last season, certainly. Now, there are some other issues with the Mercedes power units. First of all, that it actually blew up in Australia, which will prove to be some concern, but it doesn't seem like there's a massive power discrepancy like it seemed like there kind of was at the start of last season between Mercedes on the new 5% biofuel fuel that's in the cars compared to what the Red Bull and the Ferrari engines are capable of, and Alpine are slightly further behind than that. So this was the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix FP1 last year, looking at the straight line speeds, and this was a pretty consistent trend last season, right, where you'd have the Red Bull, you'd have the Williams, and then 6 to 7 kph behind you would have the Mercedes, the other cars. The Ferrari was here at 318, the Aston and the McLaren were pretty slow last year in general, so you know, this was the advantage that Red Bull would gain usually last season. There was also this in Baku last year where it was outrageous, the difference. Alpine, as I say, ran like no wings that weekend, and the thing is with Red Bull, because their car was so efficient in a straight line, they can actually add downforce, maintain some straight line speed edge over the competitors, and then be much faster in the corners. They did this last year at Monza. They actually ran a kind of a medium downforce rear wing at Monza. Didn't have a mega straight line speed advantage over Ferrari, but it was good enough to stay ahead, and they maintained their tyres, and they were better in the corners. So the Red Bull was so good that they could actually even sacrifice some straight line speed. So sometimes the numbers you see here don't fully represent the situation because they're actually running more downforce at times than their competitors and still going faster in a straight line. Baku, that wasn't necessarily the case. They were 10 kph up on the Mercedes. What's that? 14 kph up on the McLaren. So, I mean, that was what things were looking like last season. This year, it is a different story. These are the top speeds in Bahrain. Ferrari were actually the fastest in a straight line at 326, and we thought after this Grand Prix, damn, maybe Ferrari have really figured something out here with their straight line speeds, which I believe they have to a certain extent, but the Red Bull advantage is still there over most of the competitors. We can see, you know, 4, 5, 6 kph over the Mercedes, and on average it's probably been marginally less than that, especially in race conditions when there's no DRS activated. But when the DRS is on, that's when you start to get some serious issues, and when the Mercedes does need to focus on its straight line speed. So to be honest, without DRS, I mean, we saw last year, for example, in Australia, when the overtake that Verstappen did on Hamilton this year was done by Perez the year before, but that was done by Perez without DRS because their car was so much faster in a straight line, you know, a good almost 10 kph faster than the W13 because it was so draggy. This year, the W14 is definitely faster in a straight line, but it's the DRS open for the Red Bull that just gives it such an advantage. It might also be down to the ERS system, which does seem to be significantly better. This is the battery deployment from the Honda power unit than it does seem to be on the Mercedes. They even had clipping in a straight line, which basically means you're at full throttle, you're getting to the end of a straight, and your engine actually starts to back off a bit because you've deployed all your battery and there's nothing more to give. So that clipping of top speed is not ideal at all. Even the Aston Martin was experiencing this as well. So the Williams wasn't. It might just be more of a Mercedes power unit thing on those specific cars, but that is hurting their straight line speed as well towards the end of a straight. And if it's happening in qualifying, it's certainly affecting them in the race. So what can Mercedes do about this? We don't exactly know what their new car's going to look like when they bring it to Imola, but of course the rumor had it in the article, which I didn't really fully zoom in on, but as it says here, aerodynamic changes in the pipeline should strengthen in the medium term, and all in all decent start. And therefore it's expected that part of this aerodynamic upgrade will be to reduce the straight line speed advantage of the Red Bull. The pure no DRS version is not too bad, but it's the DRS advantage that Red Bull have. People have talked about it being the triple DRS effect. Effectively, it's just very good aerodynamics at the rear of that Red Bull that maybe involve how effective the diffuser is, that the Mercedes might suffer with, that they might be able to tweak when they do their B-spec version if it is more similar to a Red Bull design. So that is probably the key for Mercedes, to try and find a way to limit the advantage Red Bull have with their DRS, because if they can somehow get closer to Red Bull in that regard, they'll probably pull clear of the rest of their competitors, and then it's about trying to take the fight to Red Bull at some point in the future. But of course, the other cars, the Aston Martin, the Ferrari, they're not going to slow down with their attempts to catch up as well. And even Fernando Alonso was asked the question recently, how long is he going to stay in Formula 1? He says, I would like to know that too. I'm still fresh, still motivated, still enjoying every single day. Of course, a third world championship is the goal, but at the moment it's all about having a good season. And even Max Verstappen says he'd be quite happy to see Alonso get his 33rd victory. And he says, I think Fernando should have won already a lot more races than he has. I think he deserves a lot more. I'd be quite happy to see him win number 33. It's a nice statement from Verstappen. No doubt saying this because he knows the championship is probably wrapped up regardless. But Alonso might need to get that win sooner rather than later because, you know, with Mercedes entirely changing their design, there's a decent chance that the Aston Martin is, in a few races' time, the third fastest car rather than the second fastest that it was right at the start of the season. Very much enjoyed to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care, and I'll see you next time.